Alright, how's it going, guys? Welcome to V5 Garage. I'm going to show you today how to replace the rear brake pads on a Mk7 Golf R. This also works for the Golf GTI Performance Pack with the e-brake. I'm going to show you how to do this without using the computer programming that VW recommends you do. Now, if you do this incorrectly, you could cause damage to your vehicle. So please be very careful while doing this. All right, I've gotten the car to this stage. Make sure that it's jacked up properly. Make sure that you put cradling to prevent the car from falling if the jack fails. All right, so yeah, let's get into it. I'm only replacing the brake pads. I'm putting EBC yellow stuff. I'm replacing the stock pads. These pads have 2 track days on them, so they need to be replaced. So what we're going to start with first is removing this clip. Now, using a flathead screwdriver, just sort of stick it in there and it should pop right out. It's not very difficult. So put that aside because you will need that later. The next step is to get back in here. Now you see these little caps. This is what holds the brake caliper onto the brake caliper mounting that mounts to the suspension. So there's 2 caps here. There's one up here and there's one down here. All right, there's 2 caps. You know, they look like this. You know, these are the caps. You need to remove those, and you need a socket attachment that looks like this. This is a 7mm socket that mounts on the end of a 3/8 just regular wrench. And what you're going to need to do is you're going to have to disconnect the caliper from the mount. This is the mount and this is the caliper. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to push these hoses out of the way and slide this in. Once you do that, you're going to have to remove these. Now these are torqued on here. They're not torqued very much. It's only 26 foot-pounds. So it's not very difficult. The most difficult part is just getting the wrench in there. All right, once you've removed the bolt, just push it back just to get it out of the way of the caliper. Now we're gonna move on to the one on the bottom. The one on the bottom is actually easier to access because there's no brake line in the way. All right, so push that back. Now, I should tell you before you do this, remove the parking brake, make sure that it's off. You also need to loosen the cap that's on the brake master cylinder. And what this does is it allows the system to become depressurized. So that way you can force the cylinder open when the time comes. So, yeah, all we gotta do is just take this off, put it in a safe place. Make sure nothing gets in there. Brake fluid cannot be contaminated, otherwise you lose braking force. So, now the caliper, make sure to push these screws back, should come off with a little bit of force. Okay, here we go. Okay, there we go. Yeah, your brake pads will most likely fall out. We'll look at those in a minute. So there's 3 different cables that run into this. There's a brake fluid line, and then there's 2 other lines that run into this, which is the e-brake motor. And what happens is this motor, there's a motor in here with a little gearbox, and it controls a cog that's on the bottom end of this. And what happens is when that cog spins, it pushes the caliper in until it gets firmly up against the piston enough, the motor cuts off and the e-brake is on. So we're gonna figure out a way to secure this so that way it's not dangling on those cords. So the next step is to remove the electric motor here that is actually, it's the electronic parking brake servo. All right, so what we're actually gonna do now is we're gonna use a number 5 Allen key. When I say number 5, I mean 5 millimeters, to loosen these 2 bolts here and here. Once we do that, the servo for the electronic parking brake will come loose to the rest of the brake caliper. Okay, so once that drops out, make sure we grab that. This motor will now come out from the rest of the brake caliper. Now this, of course, is the alternative. It may be more complicated to the computer system that you have to buy in order to do this electronically, but the computer system costs money, and there's always people out there that want to save money. So this is what you're going to get with. You're not actually going to touch anything with the motor. What you're going to do is, this is the spline that goes into the screw that's inside of this piston. Now, depending on how worn out your brake pads are, and I'll show you mine in a second, how worn out they are. This is potentially going to be at its maximum setting, or it's almost at its maximum setting, meaning that it's been screwed all the way counterclockwise. So basically what you're going to do is, I have here, to avoid contaminating this, because it's covered in grease and there's seals and stuff, so you want to make sure you keep this clean. This is a 9mm socket on the end of a screwdriver, and all I'm going to do is rotate this counterclockwise, or excuse me, clockwise, all the way until it stops. That's it, right? It stopped. You can do it by hand. I don't recommend doing it by hand, just because you're going to get grease all over your fingers and you're going to potentially contaminate all that. So I use a socket, which I cleaned before with acetone. I know it's very clean. Now that you've twisted this as far clockwise as it'll go, the next step is to compress the piston. This is pretty easy to do. I just use a DeWalt clamp. It's just something like this. It's not possible to do this like how it is on the front brakes or on normal brakes if you have this connected, as in if you have the servo connected, because it's locked up, it won't let you do anything. So, you know, be careful not to put the end of the clamp on that surface. So here we go. There you go. Yeah. Now this, of course, if you have the correct brake if you have the correct brake piston compression tool, of course you can use that. I don't have one of those, so I'm using this. All you got to do is just squeeze. The piston will compress it all the way in. Okay, that's that. Next, we're going to reattach the servo motor to this. The reason why I don't cut the cable yet is because you still have to put copper grease on your pads and install those before you can mess around with the caliper. So we're going to go ahead and refit this. Now make sure that, you have to make sure that these splines are lined up. If they're not, you can just grab your 9mm socket again and just twist it slightly in one direction. Well, I guess twist it slightly counterclockwise, because this should be in the fully clockwise position. Reinstall this. Alright, there we go. Make sure your screws are aligned. Alright, once you get to this point, I'm not aware of a torque specification for these. I just hand tighten them. What we're going to do now is we're going to put on the brake pads, and after that we'll cut the cable and we'll reinstall the brake caliper. So as you can see in my left hand, we have the original OEM pad with 2 track days on it, and in my right hand we have this is a EBC yellow stuff. I highly recommend these pads. You know, they're great pads, but as you can see, these OEM pads were almost down to the metal. There's maybe 2 millimeters of material actually left on them. They hadn't started to squeak yet, but they really were past their sell-by date, so it's a good thing that we're replacing them. Make sure to be very careful when you're handling your brake pads if your gloves are covered in copper grease. I'm actually going to change my gloves before I work on the next set, because if this stuff gets on the actual braking material that touches the rotor, it can be very dangerous. So put it there, put some here. Now this just slides right in. Because this is the outside caliper, there's no contact in the middle of the pad, so we're not going to put any grease on there. Just double check that surface for no grease. Alrighty, once that's done, we can now reinstall the caliper. So, I'm going to reposition the caliper. This should slip on relatively easily. Make sure those bolts are in. All right. There we go. Okay. Now, once you're done hand tightening these, the torque specification for these is 35 Newton meters, which is 26 foot-pounds. It is a little difficult to get a torque wrench in here, so I'm not actually going to show you that. But that is the torque specification for these bolts. Okay, once you've torqued your bolts, make sure to remember to put these caps back on. One on the top, one on the bottom. Once you're done with that, the last step is to put this clip back on. Slides in here. Push it in, and that's that. All right, so once you've torqued your wheels back on, remember to come up here. You got to put your cap back on, make sure that it's clean, make sure that there's nothing in there. Tighten it. Then pump the brakes until they get firm again. All right, nice and firm. Turn it back on. All right, so that's it. That is how you replace the rear brake pads on a Mk7 Golf R and a Mk7 GTI performance pack with electronic e-brake without using VCDS.